The morning fog rolled thick through the San Fernando Valley on February 24, 1986, wrapping around the sprawling condominiums of Van Nuys like ghostly fingers reaching into the heart of suburban Los Angeles. The sun struggled to break through the gray veil, casting everything in muted tones, the kind of light that made even the most ordinary morning feel ominous, as if the world itself was holding its breath. John Rowetton stepped out of his condominium on Balboa Boulevard at exactly 7:20 a.m., his breath visible in the cool morning air. The mechanical engineer's routine was as precise as the computer peripherals he designed at Micropolis. Kiss his wife goodbye, grab his briefcase, check that the front door was locked. But this morning something felt different. There was a weight in the silence, a tension that seemed to press against his shoulders as he walked to his car. Behind him, in the warmth of their shared home, Sherri Rasmussen stood at the kitchen window, watching her husband disappear into the fog. At 29, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that turned heads without effort. Tall, athletic, with striking features that radiated both intelligence and warmth. As head nurse of UCLA's coronary care unit, she saved lives daily. But this morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that danger was creeping closer to her own. The phone had been ringing at odd hours again. Hang-up calls that left nothing but dead air and the sound of breathing. Sherri knew who was behind them, just as she knew who had been appearing at her workplace, who had been watching from the shadows of their parking garage. The woman in the LAPD uniform, who wouldn't let go of a past that had never truly belonged to her. Stephanie Lazarus. The name had become a source of dread in the Rowetton household, whispered in conversations that grew more urgent with each passing week. What had begun as an uncomfortable reminder of John's college days had evolved into something far more sinister, a stalking that felt like a noose slowly tightening around their necks. As John's taillights vanished into the morning mist, Sherri felt the familiar knot of anxiety twist in her stomach. She had planned to deliver a motivational presentation at Glendale Adventist Medical Center today, but her back ached from yesterday's aerobics class, and the thought of facing another day of suspicious glances and whispered conversations felt overwhelming. Maybe she would call in sick. Maybe she would stay home safe behind locked doors, and the security system they'd recently installed, the one with the alarm code 11. She couldn't have known that 50 miles away in a Granada Hills condominium, Stephanie Lazarus was staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her hands gripping the porcelain sink until her knuckles turned white. The LAPD officer's usual composure had cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. Her roommate had moved out exactly 10 days ago, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the growing obsession that consumed her every waking moment. Lazarus reached for her phone with trembling fingers, dialing the number she had memorized like a prayer. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a voice answered, not the voice she longed to hear, but the voice that had become the soundtrack to her nightmares. "Hello?" Sherri's voice was soft, still heavy with sleep. The rage hit Lazarus like a physical blow. She slammed the phone down, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The sound of Sherri's voice, casual, untroubled, claiming the life that should have been hers, ignited something primal and dangerous in her chest. She looked at her reflection again, this time seeing not the dedicated police officer her colleagues knew, but a woman pushed to the very edge of sanity. In her bedroom closet hung her LAPD uniform, pressed and ready. Her service weapon sat in its holster, cold and weighted with possibility. And in her mind a plan began to form, desperate, illogical, but crystallizing with each passing second. She was going to see John today. Whatever it took. The story of how 3 lives became fatally intertwined had begun 4 years earlier, in the dormitories of UCLA. John Rowetton was a quiet mechanical engineering student from San Diego, focused on his studies and athletic pursuits. Stephanie Lazarus was a political science major from Simi Valley, ambitious and intense, with dreams of law enforcement dancing in her head. Their rooms in Dykstra Hall were just doors apart, but their worlds couldn't have been more different. To John, Their occasional dates were casual encounters, the kind of college experimentation that meant little beyond momentary companionship. He was polite, friendly, but never fully present in the way that Stephanie craved. To her friends, she seemed to take the relationship far more seriously than he did, analyzing every conversation, every gesture, every moment of contact as if it were a coded message meant just for her. Stephanie's intensity manifested in ways that would have been red flags to anyone paying attention. She would steal John's clothes while he showered, as if claiming pieces of his identity for herself. She took photographs of him while he slept, capturing moments of vulnerability that he never consented to share. When they finally became intimate after his graduation, she interpreted it as validation of a connection that existed more in her imagination than in reality. "We had sex 20 to 30 times between 1981 and 1984, John would later testify, his voice hollow with regret. But I never considered her my girlfriend. The disconnect was profound and dangerous. While John saw their encounters as casual, Stephanie was weaving a narrative of destiny, of a love story that would eventually triumph over all obstacles. She spoke of him as her college boyfriend to her police academy classmates, attended his work Christmas parties as his date, and began planning a future that he had never agreed to share. Meanwhile, Stephanie's transformation from college student to police officer was rapid and complete. The LAPD was actively recruiting women in the early 1980s, responding to pressure from discrimination lawsuits and a consent decree that demanded change. Stephanie thrived in the academy's physical challenges, particularly in combat training where her tenacity and willingness to fight for control of weapons stood out among her peers. Her first assignment was to Hollywood Division, a notorious posting where corruption and violence walked hand in hand down streets lined with vice and desperation. The Hollywood burglars scandal had recently rocked the department, resulting in the firing of 14 officers and leaving morale at an all-time low. Chief Darrell Gates himself had noted the almost carnival atmosphere that seemed to pervade the division, where the motto among officers had become, "Admit nothing, deny everything, demand proof." It was in this environment that Stephanie Lazarus learned to be a cop, and learned to hide her true nature behind the blue wall of silence that protected officers from scrutiny. Her diary from this period reveals a woman undergoing a profound psychological transformation, gradually identifying more with the department than with civilian society, developing what she described as a detached, often nonchalant attitude toward even the most brutal crimes. But her obsession with John Richtin remained constant, a dark thread running through her otherwise successful professional life. When she was transferred to the quieter Devonshire Division in March 1985, covering the San Fernando Valley communities where she would eventually make her home, she was still making plans for a reunion that John had no interest in pursuing. Then came the day that changed everything. Stephanie learned that John was engaged to marry someone else. Sherri Rasmussen entered John's life like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Born in Walla Walla, Washington, and raised in Arizona, she had graduated from high school at 16 and completed her nursing degree at Loma Linda University with the kind of academic excellence that marked her as destined for greatness. By her late 20s, she was not only the head nurse of UCLA's coronary care unit, but also an assistant clinical professor, teaching the next generation of lifesavers while pioneering new techniques in critical care. She met John at a party in June 1984, and their connection was immediate and genuine. Everything that his relationship with Stephanie had never been. Where Stephanie demanded attention and created drama, Sherri brought peace and partnership. She was accomplished in her own right, financially independent, intellectually curious, and emotionally mature. Most importantly, she loved John for who he was, not for who she imagined he could become. Their relationship developed naturally, built on mutual respect and shared goals. When John proposed, it felt like the logical next step in a journey they were taking together, not a victory wrested from circumstance or manipulation. But Stephanie Lazarus saw it differently. The news of their engagement hit her like a physical blow. Her diary entry from that period reveals the depth of her delusion and the intensity of her pain. "I really don't feel like working. I found out that John is getting married. My concentration is like one." She woke her fellow officer and roommate that night, crying for the first time that he could remember, seeking comfort for a loss that existed only in her imagination. What happened next would haunt everyone involved for decades to come. Stephanie's response to the engagement was swift and disturbing. She wrote to John's mother, pouring out her feelings in a letter that revealed the depth of her obsession. "I'm truly in love with John, and the past year has really torn me up. I wish it didn't end the way it did, and I don't think I'll ever understand his decision." But words weren't enough. Stephanie needed to see John one more time, to convince herself and him that their connection was real and worth fighting for. She visited him at his condo shortly before he moved in with Sherri, and in a moment of weakness or pity, John allowed what would be their final sexual encounter. He would later describe it as giving her closure, but for Stephanie it was validation that their story wasn't over. Armed with this perceived victory, Stephanie made a decision that would seal all their fates. She was going to confront Sherri directly. The confrontation came on a day when Stephanie appeared at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, deliberately dressed in tight shorts and a tank top, a calculated choice designed to flaunt her physicality and sexual connection to John. The conversation that followed was brief but devastating. "John and I are still having sex," Stephanie told Sherri with cold precision. "When your marriage fails, I'll be there to pick up the pieces." Sherri's response was measured but firm. "Your services won't be needed." Stephanie's mask slipped then, revealing the dangerous obsession underneath. "If I can't have John, no one else will, including you." The threat hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and malice. Sherri didn't report the incident to hospital security. Perhaps she thought it was an empty boast, the desperate words of a woman scorned. But she told her father, and she confronted John that evening, demanding to know the truth about his continued relationship with Stephanie. John admitted to the infidelity, asked for forgiveness, and promised it wouldn't happen again. But he didn't contact Stephanie to end things definitively, and he didn't take any steps to protect his fiancée from further harassment. From his perspective, the relationship with Stephanie was long over. He couldn't comprehend that in her mind, it was just beginning. The wedding of John Rowetton and Sherri Rasmussen took place in November 1985, exactly as planned. It should have been the end of Stephanie's delusions, the final proof that John had made his choice. Instead, it seemed to intensify her obsession. The hang-up calls began almost immediately. Sherri and John would answer the phone to find nothing but silence and the sound of breathing before the line went dead. The calls came at all hours, disrupting their sleep and filling their home with an atmosphere of constant surveillance. Concerned about security, the newlyweds installed a burglar alarm system before leaving for their honeymoon. Sherri chose 123 as the code, their wedding anniversary, a decision that a friend warned was too obvious, too easy to guess. But Sherri never imagined that someone would be watching closely enough to learn such intimate details of their lives. For a brief period, it seemed as though Stephanie might be moving on. Her friends and co-workers noticed her dating other men, a fitness instructor, a television news cameraman. She drafted personal ads in her diary, as if genuinely trying to find love elsewhere. But it was all surface performance, a mask worn for the benefit of those around her. Beneath the facade, Stephanie was escalating. In January 1986, she appeared at the couple's condo with her skis, asking John to wax them. Despite Sherri's obvious discomfort, John complied, perhaps still failing to grasp the true nature of Stephanie's persistence. Sherri found the visit strange, especially given Stephanie's choice to wear flattering workout clothes for such a mundane task. After Stephanie left, Sherri asked her husband directly, "Is your relationship truly over?" John assured her it was, but his words felt hollow in the face of Stephanie's continued presence in their lives. When Stephanie returned a few days later to collect the skis, this time in full uniform and armed. Sherri's discomfort transformed into genuine fear. The final confrontation came when Sherri found Stephanie in their living room one morning after John had left for work. Again, Stephanie was in uniform, using her authority as a police officer to legitimize her presence in their private space. Sherri asked her firmly to leave, and Stephanie complied, but the message was clear. There was nowhere Sherri could go that Stephanie couldn't follow. Sherri confided in her father about these incidents, but not in John, perhaps hoping to handle the situation without escalating the conflict. She didn't believe that reporting Stephanie to the police would be effective. After all, Stephanie was the police. The system that should have protected her was embodied in the very person threatening her safety. During a visit to her parents in Tucson in early February, Sherri's father, Nuys Rasmussen, tried to convince John to relocate to Arizona, even offering to help him find work at Hughes Aircraft through his connections. It was a lifeline, a chance to escape the web of obsession that was tightening around them. But John was established in his career at Micropolis, and the idea of fleeing from a problem that he still didn't fully understand felt like an overreaction. After they returned to Los Angeles, Sherri's fear intensified. She told her father that she believed Stephanie was stalking her on the street, sometimes posing as a young man to avoid recognition. The harassment had evolved from personal visits to systematic surveillance, and Sherri felt trapped in a nightmare with no clear escape. Other troubling incidents began to pile up. Sherri's car was vandalized while parked at the hospital, the perpetrator never identified. A co-worker at Glendale Adventist had been making threatening comments about Sherri's promotion, adding another layer of workplace tension to her already stressful situation. Hospital security granted her permission to park in a more secure lot, but the precaution felt inadequate against the growing sense of menace. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, Stephanie's roommate moved out of their shared Granada Hills condo, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her plans. The isolation was complete now, the last voice of potential reason silenced. For 9 days, Stephanie sat alone in her empty home, her obsession growing like a cancer in the silence. Then came February 23rd, the day before everything would change forever. A friend of John's from UCLA visited the couple's condo, and in a break from their usual routine, they used the front door instead of entering through the garage. John inadvertently left the door unlocked after his friend departed, a small mistake that would have enormous consequences. As the sun set on February 23, 1986, 3 lives hung in the balance. John Ruetten slept peacefully beside his wife, unaware that his past was about to collide catastrophically with his present. Sherri Rasmussen lay awake, her back aching from aerobics, contemplating calling in sick to work the next day. And 50 miles away, Stephanie Lazarus stared at the ceiling of her empty condo, a plan crystallizing in her mind with terrifying clarity. She had tried reason. She had tried seduction. She had tried threats and intimidation. Tomorrow, she would try something else entirely. The morning of February 24th dawned gray and cold, the fog so thick that streetlights remained on well past sunrise. John Ruetten followed his usual routine with mechanical precision, his engineer's mind focused on the day ahead at Micropolis. He kissed Sherri goodbye, gathered his briefcase, and checked the front door, finding it locked, unaware of the previous evening's oversight that had since been corrected. As his car disappeared into the mist, Sherri made her decision. Her back pain provided the perfect excuse to avoid the motivational presentation she'd been dreading. She would stay home, perhaps catching up on reading, or simply enjoying a rare, quiet day away from the hospital's constant demands. She couldn't have known that her decision to stay home was exactly what Stephanie Lazarus had been hoping for. At 9:45 a.m., a neighbor noticed that the Ruetten's garage door was standing open with no car visible inside. It was unusual. John's car should have been gone, but Sherri's BMW was always parked there during the day. The neighbor made a mental note but thought little of it. People changed their routines sometimes. 15 minutes later, John placed the first of several calls to his home from his office at Micropolis. The phone rang endlessly with no answer, and strangely, the answering machine didn't pick up. Both he and Sherri were meticulous about turning on the machine when they left the house unoccupied. The silence on the other end of the line felt wrong, like a presence where there should have been an absence. He tried again at intervals throughout the morning, each unanswered call adding to his growing unease. This wasn't like Sherri. Even if she was sick in bed, she would answer the phone, especially knowing he might worry. At noon, 2 men working as gardeners in the condominium complex found a purse and brought it to the neighbor who had noticed the open garage. Inside was identification belonging to Sherri Rasmussen. The neighbor accepted the purse, planning to return it later, still not sensing the true gravity of what was unfolding just doors away. At approximately 12:30 p.m., a maid cleaning a nearby unit heard something that would haunt her forever. The unmistakable sounds of 2 people fighting, followed by something heavy falling. But the sounds stopped quickly, and she assumed it was a domestic dispute between neighbors. She didn't hear gunshots, perhaps because the sound had been muffled, and she didn't call the police. How could she have known that what she was hearing were the final moments of a young woman's life? The afternoon stretched on with agonizing slowness. John continued calling home with increasing desperation, each unanswered ring confirming his worst fears. Sherri's sister, a nurse at another hospital, also tried reaching her and briefly heard the answering machine pick up, leaving a message that would never be returned. When John finally arrived home that evening, the first thing he noticed was broken glass scattered across the driveway. His heart began to race as he processed the scene. The glass, the missing BMW, the terrible silence that greeted his calls of Sherri's name. He found the front door unlocked, though he was certain he had secured it that morning. As he pushed it open, calling out for his wife, he was met with a scene that would replay in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Sherri lay on the living room floor in a pool of blood, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had fallen where she died. She had been shot 3 times in the chest, with enough force and precision to ensure that each wound would be fatal. The gun had been fired through a quilted blanket, an improvised silencer that spoke to premeditation and an understanding of how sound carried in the closely packed condominium complex. Signs of a violent struggle were everywhere. A porcelain vase lay shattered on the floor. The credenza had been toppled over. There was a bloody handprint next to the burglar alarm's panic button. Evidence that Sherri had tried desperately to summon help but had been stopped before she could complete the action. It appeared that someone had attempted to bind her with cord, suggesting the attack had been planned to last longer than it ultimately did. But it was the smaller details that told the real story of Sherri's final moments. She was dressed in a bathrobe, nightgown, and underwear, the clothes of someone who hadn't been expecting visitors, who had been attacked in her own home by someone she had let inside. Her face bore 15 separate injuries, including what appeared to be a muzzle bruise where a gun had been pressed against her flesh, and a laceration between her upper lip and jaw that suggested she had been struck with tremendous force. Most telling of all was the bite mark on her arm, a wound that spoke to the personal, intimate nature of the violence. This wasn't the work of a stranger. This was rage made manifest, hatred given form and unleashed in a frenzy of destruction that went far beyond simple murder. The crime scene had been staged to look like a botched burglary. Electronic equipment sat stacked at the base of the stairs, as if an interrupted thief had been gathering valuables when surprised by Sherri's unexpected presence. But the staging was imperfect, the work of someone who understood criminal investigation well enough to fool cursory examination, but not thorough analysis. Jewelry had been left untouched in plain sight. The gated community location made it an unlikely target for random crime. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, despite prominently displayed alarm warnings that should have deterred opportunistic burglars. Most damning of all, there was blood evidence on the stacked electronics. Sherri's blood, transferred there after the violence had ended, proving that someone had arranged the scene to support a false narrative of interrupted theft. As sirens wailed in the distance and police cars converged on the quiet Van Nuys street, John Ruetten stood in his living room cradling his dead wife, his world shattered beyond repair. He didn't yet know that the person responsible was someone they had both trusted, someone sworn to protect and serve, someone whose badge had become a license for murder. The investigation that followed would be a masterclass in tunnel vision and institutional protection, a 23-year journey through deception, evidence tampering, and the blue wall of silence that shields the guilty along with the innocent. But in that moment, as John held Sherri's lifeless body and waited for help that had come too late, only one thing was certain. The woman who had dedicated her life to saving others had been brutally murdered in her own home, and her killer was walking free with a badge and a gun, protected by the very system that should have brought her to justice. The fog that had shrouded Van Nuys that morning was beginning to lift, but the darkness that descended on the Rasmussen case would linger for more than 2 decades, a shadow that would touch dozens of lives and expose corruption at the very heart of the Los Angeles Police Department. As the first responding officers began to process the scene, none of them could have imagined that they were standing at the beginning of one of the most shocking police corruption cases in Los Angeles history. A case that would ultimately prove that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones wearing badges. Detective Lyle Meyer arrived at the Van Nuys crime scene with the weary confidence of a 20-year veteran who had seen every variation of human violence the city could produce. The fog was finally beginning to lift from the San Fernando Valley, but shadows still clung to the corners of the Ruetten condominium complex like guilty secrets refusing to be exposed. As he ducked under the yellow tape and entered the blood-soaked living room, Meyer's experienced eyes began cataloging evidence with the mechanical precision that had made him one of the department's most respected homicide detectives. But even the most experienced investigators can be blinded by their own assumptions, and Meyer was about to make a series of decisions that would shield a killer for more than 2 decades. The scene told a story that seemed obvious at first glance. A burglary interrupted, a homeowner surprised, violence escalating beyond control, electronic equipment stacked near the stairs, jewelry box untouched but visible, a missing vehicle. It fit the template of dozens of similar crimes that plagued Los Angeles in the drug-fueled chaos of the gang wars, and the crack epidemic had stretched the LAPD thin, creating pressure to close cases quickly and move on to the next crisis. Meyer's partner, Detective Steve Hooks, shared his initial assessment. They were looking at a botched burglary, probably committed by 2 perpetrators, one who had fled in the victim's car, another who might still be at large. The bite mark on Sherri's arm gave Hooks pause. Bites during struggles were more commonly inflicted by women, while the majority of burglars were men. But men had been known to bite during fights as well, and the evidence could support their working theory. What they couldn't see, or chose not to see, were the inconsistencies that would later prove devastating to their investigation. The first person to challenge their assumptions was Nuys Rasmussen, Sherri's father, a man whose grief was matched only by his determination to find his daughter's killer. When Meyer and Hooks interviewed him and his wife Loretta the day after the murder, Nuys didn't simply answer their questions. He presented them with a suspect. "You need to look at Stephanie Lazarus," he told them, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "She's a police officer. She's been harassing my daughter." Nuys recounted the confrontation at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, the threats Stephanie had made, the pattern of stalking that had escalated in the months leading up to Sherri's murder. He watched as Detective Meyer dutifully wrote down the information, noting Stephanie's name and occupation in his case file. But when Nuys pressed for details about how they would investigate this lead, Meyer's response was dismissive. "There's nothing there." It was a phrase that would haunt the case for decades. 4 words that represented either catastrophic tunnel vision or something far more sinister. John Ruetten, still numb with shock and drowning in guilt, provided his own account during a second interview the morning after discovering his wife's body. When detectives raised the possibility of a jealous former lover, John mentioned Stephanie Lazarus, but downplayed their relationship. He admitted they had been involved but insisted it was long over, that there was nothing serious between them. What John didn't tell the detectives couldn't bring himself to say was the full truth about his final sexual encounter with Stephanie after his engagement to Sherri, or the confrontation where Stephanie had threatened his fiancée. Perhaps he was protecting his own reputation, or perhaps he genuinely didn't understand the significance of these details. Either way, his omissions would prove crucial to Stephanie's escape from suspicion. But it was Maya's handling of the Lazarus lead that would later draw the most scrutiny. According to the detective's own notes, he had confirmed that Stephanie was a former girlfriend of the victim's husband. Yet no record exists of any follow-up investigation, no interview with Stephanie, no attempt to verify her whereabouts on the day of the murder, no inquiry into her duty roster or her possession of weapons. In his subsequent interviews, John recalled that Maya had asked him to remove his shirt to check for scratches, evidence that investigators suspected Sherri might have injured her attacker during the struggle. Photographs were taken, but these images would later vanish from the case file, along with other potentially crucial evidence. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in selective attention. Maya and Hooks pursued the burglary theory with single-minded determination, focusing on similar crimes in the area and known offenders who fit their profile. When a man was arrested for a burglary in progress at a similar Van Nuys condominium 2 months later, they were certain they had found their suspect. His fingerprints didn't match those found at the Rasmussen scene, but they continued searching for other members of what they assumed was a burglary crew. Meanwhile, crucial evidence was either overlooked or mishandled. The bite mark on Sherri's arm was photographed and swabbed for analysis, but no attempt was made to match it against potential suspects. The blood evidence that would later prove the electronics had been stacked after the murder went unanalyzed. Most critically, a bloody fingerprint visible on one of the stereo components, a print most likely left by the killer, was noted by criminalists, but never properly collected or photographed. 11 days after the murder, Sherri's BMW was found abandoned on a residential street roughly 2 miles from the crime scene. It was unlocked with the keys in the ignition, and while crime scene technicians found some blood evidence and 4 unidentified fingerprints, the discovery was treated as confirmation of the burglary theory rather than an opportunity for deeper investigation. The location where the car was found became another piece of evidence twisted to support the predetermined narrative. Maya noted that burglars were known to live in the area, reinforcing his belief that the crime had been committed by local criminals rather than someone with a personal connection to the victim. As weeks turned to months, the investigation stalled. The LAPD was overwhelmed by the violence plaguing Los Angeles, and resources were stretched thin. The Rasmussen case, filed under the burglary category, became just another unsolved crime in a city where murder had become routine. But for the Rasmussen family, the lack of progress was devastating. They found the detectives at Van Nuys unresponsive to their calls, often hanging up or putting them on indefinite hold when they pressed for updates. When Nuys Rasmussen called to reiterate his suspicions about Stephanie Lazarus, he was told he watched too much television. The family's frustration reached a breaking point exactly 1 year after Sherri's death. At a news conference, they reiterated their offer of a reward and called for more action from the police department. Nuys wrote directly to Chief Daryl Gates about the possibility that Stephanie Lazarus might have been involved, but his letter was dismissed by subordinates who never brought it to the chief's attention. True crime writer Ann Rule, famous for her work on serial killer Ted Bundy, initially showed interest in writing a book about the case. Nuys met with her and explained his suspicions about the LAPD officer who had threatened his daughter. But Rule's enthusiasm quickly cooled after consulting with a retired LAPD detective who assisted her with research. The man told her the case was too hot to handle, and Rule withdrew from the project. Even this early warning sign that the case might involve police corruption failed to trigger any official investigation. While the official investigation withered, Stephanie Lazarus's career flourished. The young officer who had murdered Sherri Rasmussen in a jealous rage was transforming herself into a model police professional, building a reputation that would shield her from suspicion for more than 2 decades. In the months following the murder, colleagues noted that Stephanie seemed to be moving on from her obsession with John Retton. She dated other men, worked part-time security jobs, and even drafted personal ads in her diary. To outside observers, she appeared to be a woman who had overcome heartbreak and was building a new life. But the appearance of normalcy was carefully constructed. In January 1986, just weeks before the murder, Stephanie had visited John and Sherri's condo one final time, asking him to wax her skis. When she returned to collect them days later, she was in uniform and armed, a deliberate display of her authority and access to weapons. Now, with Sherri dead and John devastated by grief, Stephanie began the long process of inserting herself back into his life. In 1989, she engineered a reunion during a Hawaii vacation, rekindling their physical relationship with a man too traumatized to recognize the predator who had destroyed his world. The psychological manipulation was masterful. John later recalled having sex with Stephanie occasionally over the next 2 years, never suspecting that the woman sharing his bed was the same person who had murdered his wife. When he moved back to the Los Angeles area in 1991 and met his second wife, Stephanie's hold over him finally ended. But by then, she had established an unshakable alibi of continued friendship and intimacy. Stephanie's professional advancement during this period was remarkable. In 1994, she was promoted to detective after distinguished service in the Drug Abuse Resistance Education (DARE) program and background investigations of new recruits. Her supervisors praised her thoroughness and tenacity, qualities that would take on sinister significance in light of later revelation. In 1997, she married a fellow officer she had met while teaching a DARE class in Oregon. Together, they adopted a daughter and moved back to Simi Valley, creating the appearance of a stable family life. Her husband later joined the LAPD as well, further cementing Stephanie's position within the department's social structure. But it was Stephanie's assignments during the 1990s that would later raise the most troubling questions about potential evidence tampering. For 2 separate periods, she was stationed at the Van Nuys Division, the same facility where the Rasmussen murder book was kept on an easily accessible shelf for unsolved cases. Colleagues from that era recalled that Stephanie frequently volunteered for overnight shifts, when she would be the only detective on duty with minimal supervision and little need to go into the field. During these long, quiet hours, she would have had unrestricted access to the case files that contained evidence of her crime. Between her Van Nuys assignments, Stephanie worked for the LAPD's Internal Affairs Division, investigating misconduct by fellow officers. The irony was staggering. A murderer tasked with policing the police, someone who had violated the most fundamental oath of law enforcement, now sitting in judgment of others' transgressions. Department records showed that in both background investigations and internal affairs, Stephanie distinguished herself with the thoroughness and tenacity of her work. She was meticulous in documenting misconduct, relentless in pursuing evidence, and uncompromising in her pursuit of the truth. Except when it came to her own crimes. The missing evidence began to accumulate like shadows in the corners of the murder book. Handwritten chronological notes that should have documented Meyer and Hooks's daily investigative activities during the first crucial months simply didn't exist, despite LAPD protocol requiring such records. The typed chronological record, the chrono that served as the official timeline of the investigation, contained its own troubling anomalies. John Retton's name was consistently misspelled as Ritter throughout the document, making it harder for future investigators to find him should they attempt to follow up on the case. The notes lacked the required initials of the recording detective and showed no indication of who had typed them. Most suspicious of all, the chrono appeared to have been typed in a single sitting by the same person, despite supposedly documenting months of investigative activity by multiple detectives. The consistent spacing and typeface suggested a document created after the fact, possibly to replace original notes that had been lost or deliberately destroyed. Crucial interviews were missing from the record entirely. Both Nuys Rasmussen and John Ratton recalled giving statements that discussed Stephanie Lazarus in detail, but no transcripts or recordings of these conversations existed in the official file. The only mention of Stephanie in the entire investigation was Maya's brief note confirming her identity as a former girlfriend. Evidence that should have pointed towards Stephanie was either overlooked or disappeared entirely. The polygraph test that John's sister-in-law remembered him taking the day after the crime was absent from the record, though a second test 2 weeks later was documented. Photos of John without his shirt, taken to check for scratches that might have been inflicted by Sherri during her struggle with her killer, vanished from the file. Most damning of all, a bloody fingerprint clearly visible on the stereo equipment that had been stacked to simulate a burglary was never collected or properly analyzed. Crime scene technicians had noted its presence, but the print was never entered into evidence, and the stereo component itself was never retained for further analysis. The pattern suggested either gross incompetence or something far more deliberate. Given that Stephanie Lazarus had unrestricted access to the case file during her assignments at Nuys, and given her background in internal affairs investigations that taught her how evidence was collected and preserved, the possibility of tampering could not be dismissed. In 1993, the case received renewed attention when DNA testing became more widely available. Nuys Rasmussen, still desperate for answers 7 years after his daughter's murder, offered to pay for DNA analysis of the evidence collected from the crime scene. His request was denied with the explanation that police needed to have a suspect in order to proceed with testing. The response was both bureaucratic and illogical. DNA testing was increasingly being used to solve cold cases by comparing unknown samples to offender databases. The LAPD's reluctance to test evidence in a brutal murder case suggested either departmental incompetence or active resistance to solving the crime. Department records show that detectives did conduct some follow-up investigation in 1993, checking latent fingerprints against recently paroled offenders and ordering new tests on existing evidence. But this activity was superficial, designed more to create the appearance of progress than to generate actual leads. What the records don't show is equally significant. A detective signed a form indicating he had visited the county coroner's office to collect trace evidence, but when questioned years later, he had no memory of the visit or of working the case at all. Hair samples were collected during this visit, but the bite swab that would later prove crucial to identifying Stephanie Lazarus was left behind. The pattern was becoming clear. Evidence that might have led to Stephanie was being systematically avoided or overlooked, while investigators pursued increasingly unlikely theories about unknown burglars and paroled offenders. Meanwhile, the Rasmussen family's relationship with the LAPD continued to deteriorate. Nuys made regular calls and visits to the detectives, some of which became contentious as his frustration mounted. But these conversations, which should have been documented in the case file, were never recorded in the official record. In 1997, a former co-worker of Sherri's secretary contacted police with potentially significant information. The secretary had told her about the January 1986 incident where Stephanie Lazarus had confronted Sherri in her office, making it clear that the harassment had been witnessed and discussed by others. But no attempt was made to follow up on this lead, before the secretary died 3 years later, taking her first-hand account to the grave. The message was clear. The LAPD had no interest in pursuing leads that might implicate one of their own officers in the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. As the 1990s drew to a close, advances in forensic science began to offer new hope for solving cold cases. DNA testing had evolved from an experimental technique to a standard tool of criminal investigation, and the LAPD formed a new unit specifically tasked with reviewing old cases for evidence that might yield genetic profiles. Among the cases selected for review was the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. The violence of the crime, the large amount of blood evidence, and the bite mark that had been swabbed at the scene made it an ideal candidate for DNA analysis. In 2004, criminalist Jennifer Francis was assigned to analyze the evidence from the Rasmussen case. What she discovered would eventually crack the case wide open, but not before encountering resistance that suggested the cover-up extended far beyond the original investigators. Francis first attempted to analyze blood samples from the crime scene, hoping to find genetic material from the killer mixed with Sherri's blood. But the tests revealed only Sherri's DNA, the victim's rare blood subtype, initially creating confusion about whether there were multiple sources for the collected samples. Frustrated but not defeated, Francis turned to the bite swab that had been collected from Sherri's arm. The detective supervising her work had noted that the sample was missing from the property log. But Francis was persistent. After calls to the county coroner's office initially came up empty, she finally reached the original criminalist who had collected the sample. The old evidence was found in a freezer, unlabeled and unlogged in the office's computer database. When Francis finally obtained the sample and subjected it to analysis, the results were earth-shaking. The saliva contained DNA from an unknown female. The discovery should have revolutionized the investigation. For 18 years, detectives had been pursuing male burglars and overlooking female suspects. Now they had scientific proof that Sherri Rasmussen had been killed by a woman, someone close enough to bite her during their struggle, someone filled with enough rage to inflict 15 separate facial injuries before delivering 3 fatal gunshots. Francis reviewed the case file, looking for female suspects who might have had motive to kill Sherri. She found mention of a disgruntled nurse at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, but when she asked her supervisor about investigating this lead, his response was telling, "Oh, you mean the LAPD detective." Francis was unaware that Stephanie Lazarus was a police officer. She had overlooked the single vague reference to her in the file, focusing instead on the nurse who had made threatening comments about Sherri's promotion. But her supervisor's comment revealed that at least some members of the LAPD knew exactly who the female DNA sample belonged to. "She's not a part of this," the detective insisted, maintaining the department's long-standing position that the crime was a burglary committed by unknown perpetrators. Francis's discovery of female DNA was buried in the files, and no detective would pursue the case further. The evidence that could have solved the murder of Sherri Rasmussen was locked away, protected by the same blue wall of silence that had shielded Stephanie Lazarus for nearly 2 decades. The years that followed were marked by silence and stagnation. Stephanie Lazarus continued her rise through the LAPD hierarchy, eventually becoming part of the nation's only full-time art theft unit. Her work gained media attention when she and her partner recovered valuable stolen artifacts, burnishing her reputation as a dedicated and effective detective. Behind the scenes, she had started her own private investigation firm, Unique Investigations, using her police credentials and investigative skills to build a successful side business. The woman who had committed murder with impunity was now being paid to solve other people's problems. John Rushin had remarried and was trying to rebuild his life, but the trauma of finding his first wife's mutilated body haunted him constantly. He occasionally reached out to Detective Meyer, asking if there was any new evidence linking Stephanie Lazarus to Sherri's death. The answer was always the same. There was nothing there. Nels and Loretta Rasmussen continued their lonely vigil, keeping their daughter's case alive through media appearances and reward offerings. They worked with the television series Murder One on a segment inspired by the case, but their efforts to generate new leads were frustrated by the LAPD's continued insistence that the crime had been a burglary. The family's pain was compounded by their growing certainty that the police were either incompetent or actively obstructing the investigation. Nels couldn't understand how detectives could dismiss the obvious suspect, a jealous police officer who had threatened his daughter in favor of pursuing phantom burglars who had never been identified despite years of investigation. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved, another victim of institutional failure and the corrupting influence of the blue wall of silence. Stephanie Lazarus had committed the perfect crime, protected by her badge and the loyalty of colleagues who prioritized the department's reputation over justice for a murdered nurse. But on a March morning in 2008, everything changed. Detective Jim Nuttall arrived at the Van Nuys Homicide Division to find a box sitting on the floor near his desk. Inside were 2 cold case files that someone had left for his review. One of them was the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. As Nuttall opened the file and began reading, he felt the familiar stirring of investigative instincts that had made him one of the department's most respected detectives. The crime scene photos showed a level of violence that spoke to personal rage, not the opportunistic brutality of a burglary gone wrong. The evidence suggested careful staging rather than genuine theft. Most intriguingly, the DNA analysis from 2004 had identified a female perpetrator in a case that had been investigated exclusively as male-on-female violence. Nuttall shared the file with his partner, Pete Barber, and both detectives reached the same conclusion. This was not a burglary. This was murder, carefully planned and executed by someone who knew the victim personally. But as they dug deeper into the case, they encountered the same resistance that had frustrated Jennifer Francis years earlier. When they developed a list of 5 female suspects and began investigating each one systematically, they discovered that one of their prime suspects was not just any police officer, but a detective working in the same building where they had their offices. Stephanie Lazarus had been promoted to the Commercial Crimes Division, where she worked art theft cases just floors away from the detectives who were finally closing in on her 22-year secret. She had a husband who also worked as a detective, friends throughout the department, and a reputation that could provide early warning of any investigation. Nuttall and Barber knew they would have only one chance to gather evidence before their suspect disappeared. They began referring to Stephanie only as Number 5, worked on the case after hours, and developed cover stories to explain their interest in personnel records from 2 decades earlier. The investigation they conducted was everything the original inquiry should have been: thorough, methodical, and focused on evidence rather than assumptions. When they discovered that Stephanie had reported her backup weapon stolen 13 days after the murder, .38 caliber revolver compatible with the ammunition used to kill Sherri, they knew they were on the right track. When they learned that Stephanie had been off duty the day of the murder, had the training to stage a crime scene, and possessed the knowledge to make the death look like a burglary, the pieces began falling into place with terrifying clarity. But they still needed definitive proof. DNA evidence from the bite mark had identified a female perpetrator, but they needed a sample from Stephanie Lazarus to make a definitive match. On a quiet afternoon in Simi Valley, Stephanie Lazarus discarded a cup she had been drinking from at a local Costco. Police surveillance teams retrieved the cup, and a DNA sample was extracted from the saliva residue. The match was perfect. After 22 years of lies, cover-ups, and institutional protection, science had finally identified the killer of Sherri Rasmussen. Detective Stephanie Lazarus, sworn to protect and serve, had murdered an innocent woman in a jealous rage and then used her position and knowledge to shield herself from justice. The blue wall of silence that had protected her was about to come crashing down, but not before revealing the depths of corruption within the Los Angeles Police Department. As news of the DNA match reached the highest levels of the LAPD, Chief William Bratton and senior prosecutors began planning an arrest that would shock the law enforcement community and expose decades of institutional failure. The perfect murder was about to become the perfect scandal, and Stephanie Lazarus's 22-year masquerade as a dedicated police officer was finally coming to an end. But even as justice appeared to be closing in, questions remained. How many other cases had been compromised by police officers protecting their own? How much evidence had been destroyed or manipulated over the years? And would the full truth ever come to light, or would the blue wall of silence simply shift to protect new secrets? The answers would emerge in a courtroom confrontation that would pit detective against detective, system against system, and truth against the most powerful force in law enforcement. the code of silence that protects the guilty along with the innocent. The morning of June 5, 2009, dawned bright and clear over Los Angeles, the kind of California day that normally promised hope and new beginnings. But in the sterile corridors of Parker Center, the LAPD's downtown headquarters, Detective Stephanie Lazarus was walking toward the end of her carefully constructed world, one measured step at a time. She had no idea that her life was about to implode. For 23 years, Stephanie had lived with the secret of what she had done in that Van Nuys condominium. She had built a successful career, married a fellow officer, adopted a daughter, and earned the respect of colleagues who saw her as a dedicated professional. The murder of Sherri Rasmussen had become a distant nightmare, buried so deep in departmental files and institutional indifference that it seemed like it might stay hidden forever. But the DNA on that discarded Costco cup had changed everything. Chief William Bratton had been personally briefed on the case, along with senior prosecutors from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. The implications were staggering. One of their own detectives was about to be arrested for a murder that had remained unsolved for more than 2 decades. The scandal would rock the department to its foundation and raise uncomfortable questions about corruption, cover-ups, and the blue wall of silence that protected guilty officers along with innocent ones. The arrest had been planned with military precision. Dozens of officers had been briefed that morning, told only that they would be executing a search warrant somewhere outside the city limits. They were transported to staging areas near Stephanie's Simi Valley home and the Metrolink station where she commuted to downtown Los Angeles, unaware that their target was a fellow officer. Meanwhile, RHD detectives Greg Stearns and Dan Jaramillo had been selected for the most delicate part of the operation, luring Stephanie to Parker Center for an interview that would precede her arrest. They had been chosen specifically because they had no personal connection to her, reducing the risk that friendship or loyalty might compromise the investigation. The phone call came while Stephanie was working at her desk in the Commercial Crimes Division, reviewing case files for art theft investigations. The voice on the other end was professional, matter-of-fact. "Detective Lazarus, this is Detective Stearns from RHD. We have someone in custody who wants to talk about an art theft. Could you come down to Parker Center?" It was a perfectly reasonable request. Stephanie was one of only 2 detectives in the nation's only full-time art theft unit, and her expertise was frequently sought by other divisions. She gathered her files, checked her weapon into the security locker as required, and made her way to the interview room where Stearns and Jaramillo were waiting. What happened next would be dissected in courtrooms and analyzed by criminal justice experts for years to come. A masterclass in interrogation technique that pitted trained investigators against one of their own. The detectives began casually, discussing the supposed art theft case and making small talk about Stephanie's work. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, they steered the conversation toward the real purpose of the meeting. "Actually, Detective Lazarus, we wanted to talk to you about something else," Stearns said, his tone still conversational. "We're trying to tie up some loose ends in an old case, and your name came up. The Sherri Rasmussen murder from..." Stephanie's reaction was subtle but telling. Years of police training had taught her to control her expressions, to project calm authority even under pressure. But the practiced investigators watching her saw the micro-expressions that betrayed her inner turmoil, the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible pause before responding. "Sherri Rasmussen," she said, as if trying to place the name. "That was so long ago. I don't really remember much about it." But as the interview continued, Stephanie revealed more and more knowledge about the case, details that someone with no involvement should have forgotten decades earlier. She acknowledged visiting John Robin's condo, mentioned knowing about his relationship with Sherri, even made oblique references to the confrontation at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. The detectives were patient, professional, gradually building their case through careful questioning and subtle pressure. They mentioned the possibility of DNA evidence from the crime scene, watching Stephanie's face for reactions that might betray guilt or fear. "DNA evidence?" Stephanie said, her voice carefully neutral. From 1986, that would be pretty degraded by now, wouldn't it? It was the kind of response that revealed more than she intended. Detailed knowledge of forensic science that went beyond casual interest. The reaction of someone who had spent 23 years wondering if science might eventually catch up with her crimes. When the detectives finally requested a DNA sample from her, Stephanie declined and stood to leave. She had realized, perhaps too late, that she was not there as an expert consultant, but as a suspect in a murder investigation. "Am I under arrest?" she asked, as she reached for the door handle. "Yes," Detective Stearns replied. "You are." The search of Stephanie's Simi Valley home revealed the archaeology of obsession preserved across decades. In her bedroom dresser, investigators found her journal from the mid-1980s, the handwritten pages documenting her deteriorating mental state as John Ritten's relationship with Sherri Rasmussen intensified. "I really don't feel like working," she had written after learning of the engagement. "I found out that John is getting married. My concentration is like..." The entries painted a picture of a woman consumed by jealous rage. Someone who saw John's marriage not as his choice but as a theft of something that rightfully belonged to her. The final entries, written in the days before the murder, showed her psychological state deteriorating rapidly. On her computer, investigators found evidence of continued obsession stretching into the late 1990s. Internet searches for John Ritten's name, attempts to track his life and whereabouts more than a decade after she had supposedly moved on. But it was the physical evidence that proved most damning. Forensic analysis of the crime scene had revealed microscopic details that painted a vivid picture of the murder itself. Sherri had fought desperately for her life, inflicting scratches and defensive wounds on her attacker. The pattern of blood evidence showed that the violence had begun upstairs in the condominium and continued downstairs, with Stephanie using her police training to attempt to bind her victim before delivering the fatal gunshots. The weapon used was almost certainly Stephanie's backup revolver, the Smith & Wesson .38 that she had reported stolen 13 days after the murder. The timing of the theft report was no coincidence. Stephanie had disposed of the murder weapon and created a paper trail to explain its absence. Most damning of all was the staging of the crime scene. The electronics stacked at the base of the stairs had been arranged after the murder, not before. Blood evidence on the equipment proved that someone had handled these items after Sherri was already bleeding, creating the false impression of an interrupted burglary. The level of sophistication in the crime scene staging revealed the killer's law enforcement training. Only someone with detailed knowledge of police procedure would know how to make a murder look like a burglary, convincing enough to fool the initial investigators. Only someone familiar with forensic techniques would think to fire the gun through a quilt to muffle the sound, or to remove specific items like the marriage license to support the theft narrative. As news of the arrest spread through the LAPD, officers struggled to process the reality that one of their own had committed murder and hidden behind her badge for more than 2 decades. Stephanie was known throughout the department as vivacious and supportive, though some colleagues admitted they had sometimes called her Lazarus behind her back when her temper flared. The arrest sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and made headlines around the world. Here was a story that seemed ripped from the pages of a crime novel. A love triangle, a woman scorned, a cold case unsolved for decades, and the shocking revelation that the killer had been hiding in plain sight as a police detective. The legal proceedings that followed would test every aspect of the American criminal justice system. Judge Robert J. Perry, presiding over Los Angeles County Superior Court, found himself navigating a case that challenged fundamental assumptions about police conduct, evidence preservation, and the passage of time in criminal prosecution. Stephanie's defense attorney, Mark Overland, faced an almost impossible task. The DNA evidence linking his client to the crime scene was virtually unassailable, supported by forensic science that had been unavailable when the murder was committed. But Overland was a skilled litigator who understood that legal technicalities could sometimes overcome scientific certainties. His strategy focused on the age of the case and the degradation of evidence over time. In a series of pre-trial motions, he argued that the 23-year delay between crime and prosecution had denied his client due process rights. Critical evidence had been lost or destroyed, witnesses had died or forgotten crucial details, and the passage of time had made it impossible for Stephanie to mount an adequate defense. The motion was legally sophisticated, but ultimately unsuccessful. Judge Perry ruled that only intentional delays could be considered prejudicial under federal standards, and there was no evidence that prosecutors had deliberately stalled the case to disadvantage the defendant. Overland's second major motion challenged the search warrants used to collect evidence from Stephanie's home and workplace. He argued that the warrants were based on stale information that didn't establish sufficient connection between the locations searched and the likelihood of finding relevant evidence. How could investigators reasonably expect to find evidence of a 1986 murder in 2009 computers and electronic devices that hadn't existed at the time of the crime? Judge Perry admitted he was uncomfortable with some of the seized evidence, particularly from Stephanie's personal computers. But he deferred to the magistrate who had issued the original warrants, ruling that the good faith exception to the exclusionary rule applied, and all evidence could be admitted. The third motion attacked Stephanie's statements during her Parker Center interview, arguing that as a police officer, she had been compelled to answer questions or face disciplinary action. Under the Garrity rule, government employees who are forced to cooperate with investigations are entitled to automatic use immunity for their statements. Again, Judge Perry sided with the prosecution. Garrity protections applied only when there was an active administrative proceeding compelling cooperation. Stephanie had not been ordered to submit to the interview, and the detectives questioning her were not from internal affairs or her direct chain of command. Her decision to answer questions was voluntary, not compelled. The final pre-trial motion challenged the DNA evidence itself, arguing that the mini-filer system used to analyze Stephanie's genetic profile was sufficiently different from previous technology to require a separate scientific validity hearing. But Perry ruled that mini-filer was simply another form of PCR analysis, a well-established technique that didn't require additional scrutiny. With all pre-trial motions denied, the case proceeded to trial in early 2020. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, law enforcement officers, and members of the public fascinated by a story that seemed to blur the lines between reality and fiction. Prosecutor Shannon Presby opened his case with words that would echo through legal history: a bite, a bullet, a gun barrel, and a broken heart. That's the evidence that will prove to you that defendant Stephanie Lazarus murdered Sherri Rasmussen. The prosecution's case was built on multiple pillars of evidence that, taken together, painted an overwhelming picture of guilt. The DNA evidence from the bite mark was the cornerstone, scientific proof that Stephanie had been close enough to Sherri during the attack to leave biological evidence on her victim's body. But the case went far beyond forensic science. Prosecutors presented a compelling narrative of obsession and escalating violence, tracing Stephanie's psychological deterioration from college disappointment through professional success to murderous rage. John Ruetten took the witness stand, his testimony punctuated by tears as he recounted finding his wife's body and the years of guilt that followed. He acknowledged his relationship with Stephanie but insisted it had never been serious, describing their final sexual encounter after his engagement to Sherri as a mistake that he deeply regretted. The emotional centerpiece of the trial was the presentation of crime scene evidence. Prosecutors showed the jury photographs of Sherri's battered body, the 15 facial injuries that spoke to personal hatred rather than random violence. The bite mark on her arm was clearly visible, a permanent record of the intimate brutality that had characterized her final moments. Expert witnesses explained the blood evidence that proved the crime scene had been staged. The stereo equipment at the base of the stairs bore traces of Sherri's blood, proving it had been stacked after the murder to create the false impression of an interrupted burglary. FBI behavioral analyst Mark Safarik testified about the staging. explaining how the crime scene had been arranged to mislead investigators. The jewelry left untouched, the electronics carefully positioned, the missing marriage license. All were elements designed to support a false narrative of theft rather than murder. Defense attorney Mark Overland faced an uphill battle, but he fought skillfully to raise reasonable doubt. His cross-examination of the original investigators highlighted the sloppy police work that had allowed the real killer to escape detection for decades. He pointed to evidence that had never been analyzed, fingerprints that had never been collected, and alternative suspects who had never been adequately excluded. Overland's presentation of his client's case was brief but focused. He called friends and colleagues who testified that Stephanie had shown no signs of violence or obsession in the months following the murder. Her diary entries from the period documented her dating other men and apparently moving on with her life. Most importantly, Overland attacked the central pillar of the prosecution's case, the DNA evidence from the bite mark. He argued that the sample had been improperly stored for decades, potentially contaminated, and that there was even a hole in the evidence envelope that could have allowed foreign DNA to be introduced. It was a valiant effort, but the scientific evidence was simply too strong to overcome. Modern DNA analysis techniques were sensitive enough to detect even minute amounts of genetic material, and the profile extracted from the bite mark was a perfect match for Stephanie Lazarus. During closing arguments, prosecutor Paul Nuys showed the jury the horrific photographs of Sherri's injuries. One final time. It wasn't a fair fight, he told them. This was prey caught in a cage with a predator. Overland dismissed the case as circumstantial fluff and fill, save for what he called the compromised DNA sample. But his words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence that had been presented. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing hearing brought the Rasmussen family's long journey toward justice to its emotional climax. Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, now elderly and worn down by decades of fighting for their daughter's memory, finally heard the words they had waited 26 years to hear. Judge Perry sentenced Stephanie Lazarus to 27 years to life in prison, ensuring that she would be eligible for parole only after serving more than 2 decades behind bars. But even conviction and imprisonment couldn't fully resolve the questions raised by the case. The evidence of police corruption and cover-up that had protected Stephanie for so long remained largely unaddressed by official channels. The Rasmussen family filed civil lawsuits against the LAPD, alleging that the department had not only failed to solve their daughter's murder, but had actively obstructed the investigation to protect one of their own officers. The suits were ultimately dismissed on statute of limitations grounds, but they highlighted systemic failures that went far beyond a single rogue detective. Jennifer Francis, the criminalist who had discovered the female DNA evidence only to see it buried by her supervisors, filed her own whistleblower lawsuit alleging retaliation and harassment. Her case detailed a pattern of evidence suppression in high-profile cases, suggesting that the Rasmussen murder was not an isolated incident of police corruption. Francis's lawsuit was ultimately unsuccessful, but her allegations painted a disturbing picture of a department where loyalty to fellow officers trumped commitment to justice. She described being told "we're not going there" when she suggested following leads that might implicate police personnel in serious crimes. The LAPD's internal investigation into the Rasmussen case was widely criticized as inadequate. While Stephanie's conviction automatically sustained the allegation that she had murdered Sherri, the second allegation that the department had helped cover up her crime was ruled unfounded with minimal investigation. Journalist Matthew McGaugh, who spent years investigating the case for his book The Lazarus Files, concluded that the cover-up extended far beyond the original detectives. The pattern of missing evidence, altered records, and suppressed leads suggested a systematic effort to protect Stephanie Lazarus from prosecution. "It's really hard to know what could be missing if it's already gone," McGaugh observed, noting that crucial evidence had disappeared at various points over the decades when Stephanie had access to the case files. The appeals process that followed Stephanie's conviction was lengthy but ultimately unsuccessful. Her new attorney, Donald Tickle, argued that Judge Perry had made multiple errors in his pretrial rulings, but a three-judge panel of the California Court of Appeal unanimously upheld the conviction. The appellate court's decision addressed each of the defense arguments in detail. Judge Nora Margaret Manella, writing for the panel, acknowledged that Perry had made some technical errors, but found that none had prejudiced Stephanie's ability to mount an effective defense. On the question of delayed prosecution, Manella noted that while Perry had incorrectly applied federal standards, any error was harmless because the passage of time had been more prejudicial to the prosecution than the defense. Many witnesses had died or forgotten crucial details that might have helped prove the state's case. The search warrants were valid because they were based on reasonable assumptions about evidence that might still exist decades after the crime. The good faith exception properly applied because there was no evidence that investigators had lied or acted with reckless disregard for the truth in their warrant applications. Stephanie's interview statements were properly admitted because she had not been compelled to answer questions under threat of termination. The guarantee protections she claimed applied only to formal administrative proceedings, not voluntary interviews with fellow officers. Finally, the DNA evidence was reliable because Minifiler was simply an improved version of established PCR analysis techniques. The defense had not offered sufficient evidence that the new technology required separate scientific validity hearings. The California Supreme Court declined to review the case, leaving Stephanie's conviction final and her sentence intact. For 13 years, Stephanie Lazarus maintained her innocence from her cell at the California Institution for Women in Corona. She filed appeals, participated in prison programs, and built a reputation as a model inmate who helped other prisoners rebuild their lives. But in November 2023, facing her first parole hearing, she finally told the truth. "It makes me sick to this day that I took an oath to protect and serve people, and I took Sherri Rasmussen's life from her, a nurse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The confession was devastating in its honesty. Stephanie described calling the written home on the morning of February 24, 1986, hoping to hear John's voice. When Sherri answered instead, rage consumed her. She drove to the Van Nuys condominium with a gun and cord, planning to tie up Sherri if necessary to see John one last time. "I was so angry that if she got in my way to see John, I was going to strangle her," Stephanie admitted. The confrontation escalated into what she called a hellacious bar fight, ending when she bound Sherri and shot her 3 times. Believing she would be suspected, she disposed of her gun and spent the next 23 years building an elaborate lie about her whereabouts and actions. The parole board initially recommended her release, citing her relative youth at the time of the crime and exemplary behavior in prison. But the decision was appealed to the full board, which heard testimony from John Rowetton and members of Sherri's family about the continuing impact of the crime. She had 23 years to lie and to hide the evidence, and to go on with her life when she could have turned herself in, said one of Sherri's nieces. LAPD Detective Greg Stearns, who had arrested Stephanie 14 years earlier, testified about the calculated nature of her crime. "Those are not the hallmarks of youthful offense," he said. "They are the hallmarks of criminal sophistication and maturity." The parole grant was rescinded in October 2024, and a subsequent request in 2025 was also denied. Parole Board Commissioner Kevin Chappell cited discrepancies between Stephanie's account of the murder and the physical evidence, suggesting she was still not being completely truthful about what had happened in that Van Nuys condominium decades earlier. As the sun sets on this decades-long saga of murder, corruption, and justice delayed, the case of Sherri Rasmussen stands as both a triumph and a tragedy. Justice was ultimately served, but only after a quarter-century of institutional failure that allowed a killer to hide behind her badge while building a career and raising a family. The LAPD underwent significant reforms in the years following Stephanie's arrest, implementing new protocols for investigating cold cases and handling complaints against officers. But questions remain about how many other cases may have been compromised by the blue wall of silence that protected guilty officers from scrutiny. John Ruetten, now in his 60s, has found some measure of peace in knowing that his first wife's killer was finally brought to justice. He remarried years ago and built a new life, but the trauma of finding Sherri's body and the guilt of not protecting her from Stephanie's obsession will haunt him forever. Nuys Rasmussen died in 2020, just months before Stephanie's first parole hearing. But before his death, he recorded a video statement for any future proceedings, ensuring that his voice would continue advocating for his daughter's memory. "If one looks at the damage that she did to my daughter's face," he said, his voice heavy with a father's grief, "it's almost like she wanted to destroy the beauty that Sherri exuded." The case has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of institutional corruption and the importance of holding law enforcement accountable to the same standards they enforce on others. It demonstrates how the very people sworn to protect and serve can become the greatest threats to public safety when they believe themselves above the law. But perhaps most importantly, it stands as a testament to the persistence of those who refuse to let injustice stand. Without the determined advocacy of Nuys and Loretta Rasmussen, the scientific curiosity of Jennifer Francis, and the investigative tenacity of Jim Nuttall and Pete Barber, Stephanie Lazarus might have taken her secret to the grave. In the end, truth proved stronger than lies, science stronger than corruption, and justice, though delayed, stronger than the blue wall of silence that had protected a killer for more than 2 decades. Stephanie Lazarus will be eligible for parole again in 2028. She could apply earlier under special circumstances, but given the continued discrepancies in her account of the murder, it seems likely she will serve many more years behind bars. As for the broader questions raised by the case, how many other crimes have been covered up? How many other victims have been denied justice? How many other killers have hidden behind badges? Those answers may never be fully known. The blue wall of silence that protected Stephanie Lazarus still stands, perhaps hiding other secrets, other crimes, other failures of the system designed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. But on a February morning in 1986, in a Van Nuys condominium where love was supposed to triumph over obsession, where the future was supposed to be bright with promise, Sherri Rasmussen fought for her life against a predator in uniform. She lost that fight, but her memory and the evidence she left behind ultimately ensured that her killer would not escape justice forever. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all. That truth, however long buried, however carefully concealed, however protected by power and privilege, will eventually find its way to the light. The badge and the bullet may have hidden the crime for 23 years, but science, persistence, and an uncompromising commitment to justice finally revealed the truth. Sherri Rasmussen was gone, but she was not forgotten. Her killer was caught, her story was told, and her legacy became a beacon for all those who refused to let evil triumph over good. The fog that shrouded Van Nuys on that terrible morning in 1986 has long since lifted. But the clarity it revealed, the stark distinction between those who protect and those who prey, continues to illuminate the ongoing struggle between justice and corruption in American law enforcement. Some cases end with questions. This one ended with answers. And sometimes in a world where the guilty often escape consequences for their crimes, that has to be enough.